Hello, family members. I hope you're having a great day today. I want to talk about something that I think just doesn't get acknowledged enough um, because people don't necessarily understand it if it doesn't apply to them. And since I have some experience with it, I think I can get into it in a way that maybe might make sense for people who have a hard time with this. But it is perfectly possible for a person's identity to change, to fluctuate throughout their lives. And I'm not talking about people who are like, say, gender fluid or sexually fluid, where there is you know, repeating, oscillating pattern of fluctuation over short periods of time. I'm talking about people who, like, for years and years and years, may identify with a certain label, and then that changes. And it can be a gradual thing. I think it's mostly a gradual thing. That's how it was for me. But let me kind of back up and start with where my experience with this is. There is a concept in a romantic community that maybe you may or may not have heard of, uh, which is romantic. I don't know exactly how to pronounce it. I'm sorry. But essentially what it is it's a person who can feel romantic attraction or want romantic attraction, but as soon as there's any sort of reciprocation, it just evaporates. And I do believe that label would have suited me pretty well when I was in, say, college age, early college age, in my 20s basically. And I don't recall that longing to have relationships and like intense crushes like I had when I was in my early 20s, when I was a kid. So I suspect that maybe at some point I was, not lethal romantic, and then I was, and then now I'm not. Now I'm fully romance repulsed. And, that's not something, I don't feel romantic attraction anymore towards anyone under any circumstances. Whereas I had some very intense romantic, unreciprocated crushes when I was in my early 20s in college. And they were very formative for me. That was a very important thing for me, was the way that I felt and those feelings. They were significant to me. Even though there was no reciprocation, there was no really desired reciprocation, in all reality, I wonder in some ways if the intense crushes that were somewhat subconsciously directed by some sense that they wouldn't be reciprocated. I don't know. But at some point that changed. At some point that ability I had to feel some romantic desire, to wish to have a romantic relationship, to find someone attractive in a romantic way, not just sexual, but some sexual, And even now when I think about it, those feelings were very intense, and I can still very much feel the echoes of them, despite the fact that I cannot imagine feeling that way about somebody right now, you know? And so I get it. I get it where a person might be. I think it's kind of weird how we talk about stuff, talk about how someone's always identified as heterosexual, and then they end up having a same-sex relationship. And it's like we automatically assume that they were always gay or at least bisexual, and they were, just either suppressing it or just, happened to be in a opposite sex relationship and it never came up before or whatever, but it's quite possible that person was heterosexual and that at some point changed. It's possible that somebody might when at some point in their life feel like their gender identity doesn't match the one assigned at birth, but then later on feel like it does. And we have to leave room for that. We have to leave room in our queer discourse for people to live the way they live and not talk in absolutes and not talk about coming out as something that you do one time and it's permanent and you can never go back, Like, it doesn't mean that you were confused. It doesn't mean that you weren't what you said you were. It just means that that's not who you are anymore. We grow and change so much as people throughout our lives. Like, I'm 42 years old, right? And when I look back on my life, I almost feel like I'm talking about somebody else in some ways, because the Elaine of the early 2000s is a very different creature than the Elaine of the 2010s and the 2020s. So much changes you. You learn so much. Your perspective changes. I can't even imagine wanting to go back and relive any part of your life, because you are who you are now because of all the things that you've gone through. And if you try to go back and re-litigate way things went, it's not going to work right, Like, what's the point of regret? What is the point? You made the decision that you made. It's gotten you where you are, and wherever you are is a good place to be. You survived another day. I have a beloved family member who is really struggling, and what I tell them all the time is that they have one job. Everything else is secondary. Their one job is just survive. And sometimes that's all you have. But if you are surviving, then you should be proud of yourself. Every day you survived. Every day you didn't let them kick you out the door and tell you that you weren't worth anything. That's a victory, girl. Or guy, or, neither. Whatever suits you. I'm sorry. Captain. I think we need to learn how to talk more about nuance in the community. I just think that's a problem. I think that we often want to try to simplify things for the heteronormative people that find everything about being queer very confusing and sometimes scary, And I think that's the respectability politics kind of people, and I don't want to be one of the good queers. I just want to be myself, okay? And I don't think that we do ourselves any favors by trying to pretend like there are more defined categories and less nuance and less blurring of the edges. Like, that's what being queer is, It's not being constrained to the same thing that everyone else believes that they should be, a man and a woman and have a little baby, get married, all that stuff, like that is great for a lot of people, but it is not good for me. And that might change. That could change. I could at some point 10 years from now meet someone who just completely changes my perspective on everything. But it doesn't mean that I'm not aromantic now, that I'm not romance repulsed now. That is who I am. And I don't believe that my aromanticism will ever change. But if it did, it wouldn't be useful for me to lie to myself and try to pretend like that's not the case. And it wouldn't be helpful if people tried to be like, hey, you said you were one thing, how can you say you're something different now? Like, life is tough enough already. Why do we need to add extra hoops? Why do we need to add all this BS and gatekeeping and like, just if somebody tells you this is who I am, whatever label they want to use, or don't, if they don't want to use labels, however they describe what their identity is, believe them. There's no reason not to. Just believe them. Because there's no way you know their inner life better than they do. So, I was standing outside waiting for the dogs to come back in, and I was thinking about this topic. And I think the hardest thing for me sometimes is when somebody is non-binary and there's this like almost constant readjustment of exactly how they identify, and that seems a little hard for me to wrap my mind around. And I'm like, I'm having trouble remembering exactly what the best way to address this person is. Oh no, and then I feel like stupid, kind of, and I have to remember that, I try to keep that in mind when I have these intense like frustrations with people not understanding that aromantic people exist, or asexual people exist, or people with fluid identities exist. When I'm dealing with that frustration, I have to remember that it isn't easy necessarily for other people to understand my identity and be patient with them. And I try to do that. Because most people I know in real life, most people I talk to have never heard of aromanticism. And so when you have like zero knowledge, I'm sure it feels very confusing. Especially because, I'm not just aromantic, but I'm also aegosexual and pan-oriented. I have all these little modifiers that, like, people on the right wing are probably all like, oh, that's so ridiculous. And, well, it's just me describing myself. I'm allowed to describe who I am. You don't have to listen to me. In fact, most people don't. Probably not a terrible choice. But, it costs you nothing to be respectful of somebody. And you don't have to understand why they now go by different pronouns or have a different name they'd like to be called, you know, even if they're not queer. I've known people who changed their name and people just wouldn't take it seriously. And it's like, it doesn't matter why a person changes their name. Even if you think it's frivolous, even if you don't think it's frivolous, just respect it. Just respect it. You know? That we don't need to keep throwing roadblocks in people's way. You know, we don't need to make it harder for someone who's trying to figure out a fluctuating identity, who they are and how they feel comfortable living their lives, because we want to make it easier for us to understand. And I think that's what happens a lot of time is there's this pressure to try to keep things simple, not to scare the straights or not to bring too much attention to yourself, especially when you have a micro label. You know, I feel like it's always difficult when you're a spec to own your place in the queer community, because there are people who are certainly queer, you know, that they're gay or bi or whatever, that don't believe that we belong, which is wrong. And, oh golly, I'm sorry, hang on a second. If I don't drink, I'm going to die. I apologize for that one. But I think we just need to learn to own our who we are and not be afraid. And if people don't understand or don't get why something might have changed in your identity, that's a them problem, not a you problem. And I better go ahead and wrap this up while I still have some voice left, because it looks like my voice is going away. So here's a cat. That's a cat. It is. It's a cat. Her name is Osprey. And I love her. Bye, family members.